Hi everyone, I'm Grace and this is Damon, and our topic is the systemic undervaluation of care. Our research focuses primarily on the experience of women in Canadian contexts, and we were inspired to take on this project because we noticed some kind of tension between love and labor, especially in our caregivers, particularly our moms. So growing up and to this day, we feel their love as care, or we feel their care as love, joy, and pride. But it was sometimes marked by a sort of unspoken obligation or burden.
They love us deeply. We feel that love. We see crumbs disappear, groceries refilled, laundry done, meals cooked, holidays planned, with little recognition. So we asked, why are women bearing the load of care, and why is the burden so heavy? What is care? We formed this definition using synthesized research, emphasizing insights from Dr. Janet Klosterman, who's a former care worker and a feminist sociology professor we had the honor of interviewing. Care makes life possible. We broadly define it as essential, paid and unpaid work that enables people to heal, live, and thrive. Care involves physical, cognitive, social, and emotional labor that varies by context, in homes, schools, communities, hospitals, and more. But we don't always recognize care for what it is, because often it happens in private, wrapped up with love and identity. This snapshot shows how mental models limit and reinforce conceptions of care as a private and often gendered issue. This is burdensome to caregivers, especially marginalized groups. It's not that anyone wants to see others suffer or that men don't care.
Plus, as economic and societal conditions evolve, we are seeing more gender diverse partnerships where both people in the couple are working, and so the care burden is shifting. So why are we still seeing the greatest burden fall on some of our more vulnerable members of the population? So as you can see on this snapshot, it shows how dominant societal values like individualism and economic growth are contributing to the idea that care is unproductive. And on the other side, we have patriarchal norms that are persistently kind of assuming that women will take on care, women and families will take on care in private. So essentially these mental models decenter care in public policy and just sort of reinforce this burden.
So this larger map expands on the causes and impacts of care undervaluation. Where you see the black dot, the vicious cycle of burden is exacerbated for people who experience racial inequality.
So to walk you guys through a couple examples, on the far side here, we have a gender norm that is women tend to prioritize cooperative roles. This contributes to the trend that women are expected to enjoy care, which finally contributes to the pattern of women taking on more care work, especially that emotional and cognitive labor that Damon was talking about, ultimately reinforcing those gender norms in the first place. On the other side of our big map, we have dominant societal values, like I mentioned before, contributing to issues like understaffing, overworking, and a lack of public support for people who care. And when this is happening, we see gaps in care needs. And when people's needs are not being met, someone will fill them, and it tends to be care workers, caregivers, care recipients, the family members of care recipients, who are sort of exploited to fill those gaps when they don't have the support they need. And finally, I just want to point out that many of our patterns and trends are circling back to burden in the form of economic vulnerability, as well as burnout, overwhelm, and stress. As one of the care workers we interviewed said, you don't feel like you're being supported, you walk out drained day after day. So who cares about care? If we want to shift this burden, we have to take a closer look at who's involved. So this diagram shows the relationship between those involved in providing direct care and those involved in creating practices and guidelines for care. The important thing to point out here is that there's a broken connection between policymakers and caregivers, which means those who are experiencing the burden the most have the least influence on policy.
And this broken connection centers those who profit from outsourcing care, like employers and governments who are seeking cost reduction. So we can take a quick look at some global approaches to this challenge. Uruguay's care system integrates care services for children, the elderly, and disabled people. They recognize care as a social right. This is financed through a public fund with contributions from employers and employees and governments, which ensures sustainability and broad coverage. Nordic countries set universal care policies, and then municipalities are responsible for seeing through investments. This is funded primarily through taxation, which ensures access within their context, but would be difficult to replicate elsewhere. Their policy emphasizes coordination across service levels to prevent gaps, which is very applicable to the Canadian system and the various levels. New Zealand enacted a pay equity settlement, to address gender-based pay disparities in the care sector. This shows how legal frameworks can correct historical undervaluation of feminized labor. The New Zealand government allocated funding to increase wages for care and support workers. There's provisions for training and upskilling workers. However, this applies only to specific job classes and doesn't address unpaid caregiving, which is a huge part of this.
So finally, in Canada, we have the National Caregiving Strategy. It's completely based on caregiver recommendations. However, it's only in an advisory stage and there's no legislative enforcement at this time. It is good to keep in mind as a good blueprint for change that centers caregiver voices. Moving on to some levers that we came up with, given our specific research. We organized our levers for change from practical to cultural. Practical being easier to implement but having a little less leverage, and cultural being a lot harder to implement but having much more leverage. So we'll start us off with normalized flexible work. We found that current norms reinforce individualism and position care as incompatible with success. So even when flexible work arrangements are available, there's still issues in accessing them without penalty. So we suggest to incentivize employers to normalize flexible work and ensure that they can be accessed without penalty. Next, we have full-time positions and access to benefits. We found that oftentimes care roles are split up over multiple part-time roles or lack sufficient benefits and security, especially for immigrant women. So we suggest to just increase the amount of full-time care roles as well as benefits and supports.
So then moving into our structural and cultural levers, reform policy. We found policy is shaped without marginalized caregivers, which centers those dominant narratives again and overlooks self-sacrificial approaches to burden. We suggest reforming policy to prioritize caregivers and use a nuanced definition of care. Care as infrastructure. We found systems rely on invisible care to fill institutional gaps, so we suggest treating care as public infrastructure like education. Expand research. We found traditional research flattens care into tasks, so we suggest intersectional, co-created research with holistic measurements of care and lived experiences as drivers, particularly those marginalized voices. And lastly, cultural narratives. We found care is devalued because it is feminized and not seen as productive in capitalist terms. So we suggest shifting cultural narratives and including care discourse in education. Ultimately, we can't put a price onto care, but we can care for those who provide it. Lastly, we'll just take you through some of our lessons learned. Number one, systems aren't broken, they're functioning as designed. Our mom showed us care as love, sometimes marked by tension, and our research revealed how systems quietly shape love into expectation and mask exploitation. What feels deeply personal is also structural, and what feels moral is survival. We feel the tension in caregiving is as a result of systemic design, not individual virtue or personal failing. Secondly, bias is embedded in all systems. Our own biases surfaced when we assumed that better communication alone would lead to change, which failed to recognize that what counts as logic is often dictated by profit-driven power structures, not empathy or lived experience. These ideals shape what is seen as rational, valuable, or even possible.
And finally, we have the lack of language mutes the experience of caregivers. So as communicators, we know how language can shape whose experiences are seen as legitimate. And when caregivers don't have the language or the safe spaces to accurately name their realities, their experiences are dismissed. Even when they have the opportunity, they may feel like when they explain themselves, they're questioning their morality or their identity. So we advocate for you to start conversations with those you care for and who care for you, so we can honor the experience of caregivers. Care makes life possible. Let's talk about it that way. Thank you so much for listening. We also just quickly want to say a really big thank you to all the lovely people and mentors who helped us shape this project with care. Thanks.